confined space entry. Roles and responsibilities. Confined spaces pose a high risk of injury and death. Hazards in confined spaces can result in fire, explosion, unconsciousness, asphyxiation, engulfment, toxic exposure, or drowning. Confined space incidents can happen suddenly, often without any warning that something is wrong. Employers must take the necessary steps to ensure worker safety around confined space entry. Welcome to the Energy Safety Canada video series on confined space. This module reviews the roles and responsibilities of those involved in confined space entry. Understanding roles and responsibilities is essential. Knowing who is responsible for each aspect of confined space entry is critical to ensuring nothing is missed and that everyone is competent to fulfill those duties. We will review the responsibilities of the employer, supervisor, attendant or monitor, and entry worker. Employers. Employers have the most control over the worksite, and for that reason, the most responsibility. The employer must have a written code of practice or program governing the practices and procedures to be followed when workers enter to work in a confined space. Before anyone enters a confined space, the employer must appoint a competent person to conduct a hazard assessment. This person should be knowledgeable about the type of confined space and, if possible, have experience with the space in question. The hazard assessment must include all the associated testing and then specify the safety equipment and PPE for the work and identify the equipment and PPE for rescue operations. The employer needs to ensure that any worker assigned duties related to confined space is both competent themselves and they must be trained by a competent person. The employer has to ensure an entry permit system is in place prior to entry. Supervisors. Supervisors are assigned by the employer and have authority over the confined space worker and the workplace. Supervisors are responsible for explaining the hazards of the work to all workers involved in the confined space entry. They must ensure that adequate hazard controls are in place and that all workers involved have the appropriate training, personal protective equipment, tools, and equipment to safely perform the work. Supervisors must be deemed competent by the employer and understand their roles and obligations under OH&S legislation, as well as the rights of the worker. Attendants and entry monitors. Confined space attendants are also commonly called monitors, bottle watch, entrance watch, or tending worker. It is their responsibility to be in attendance outside the confined space at or near the entrance. They must track the number of persons inside the confined space and maintain communication with personnel inside. The attendant must also confirm all workers have vacated the confined space. It is critically important that the attendant understands the emergency response plan and activate it when required. Attendants cannot become rescue entrants unless they too have an entry attendant. There are many cases of well-intentioned confined space entry rescuers who become additional casualties. There may be some cases where confined space attendants may perform retrieval, non-entry rescue, with the use of retrieval systems, as long as they do not enter the space. Retrieval may not be possible due to issues with entanglement, physical limits of the extraction, or injuries to the entry workers. Refer to your company-specific policy and code of practice. Confined space attendants must also understand the legislative requirements associated with confined space entry and may require additional training for specific entry classifications or specific work situations, as identified by the hazard assessment. Confined space entry workers. All confined space entry workers must receive the required training from a competent person, use the proper equipment, and comply with the site practices and procedures. Workers are responsible for informing their employer of any limitations or competency gaps that may interfere with the ability to perform the functions of the role. Workers need to consider their physical, physiological, and psychological states before undertaking confined space entry work. Impaired vision, hearing, or physical ability can affect the ability to perform the work safely. Fatigue, workplace exposures, drugs, and alcohol should be discussed and reviewed. This may include the use of medical prescriptions or other over-the-counter drugs. Psychological states can have a significant impact on the ability of workers to assess situations and make decisions. Is there pressure to get the job done and completed on schedule? Is there a personal matter that is distracting from the tasks at hand? Workers must understand the hazards associated with confined or restricted space entry, including information on the types, signs, symptoms, and consequences of exposure to the hazards. Knowing how to inspect and use the required equipment for safe entry properly is a key responsibility for every worker and critical to keeping workers safe. Workers are responsible for raising the alarm and alerting the attendant if they recognize any signs or symptoms of exposure or a change in the conditions. All workers must exit the confined space as quickly as possible when required and must follow all applicable legislative requirements, codes of practice, and any other facility-specific standards, rules, procedures, and practices. Discuss responsibilities with your team members and confirm all hazards are assessed and managed. After the job is completed, review the process and identify any issues, no matter how small, and use the learnings for continuous improvement. Knowing and understanding the roles of all parties is essential to safely performing all of the tasks involved in confined space entry.